remove this wheel, 19mm socket, take off all 5 of your lug nuts. With this last one, the hubcap is going to want to come off if you have one. So just keep that in mind. Take that off, remove the wheel, give it a couple taps if it's stuck. Now looking at your caliper, you can stick a little pry bar or screwdriver right through this access hole here, pry out on it. That's going to compress the piston a little bit. It'll break the caliper free, allow it to move a little better. Now with a 14mm socket, remove this bolt. This is also your slider pin. And with that off, you can lift the caliper up and then slide it off the top slider pin. It'll be difficult to remove this because the brake hose is right in the way of it, so it'll basically bonk up against it. But if you just leave this in, you can twist it up and slide it out like I did. Let's set this aside for now. Let's remove this inner pad. The outer pad came off with the caliper. We'll get that off in a little bit. Oh, this one is it's pretty stuck in here. Okay. Now, with a 14mm socket, remove these 2 bolts that hold your caliper bracket onto the knuckle. Okay, leave this one in a few threads once you get it out of there. That way it'll hold the bracket while you loosen the top one. All right. Now take this one back out. Take your caliper bracket off, set it aside. We'll clean this up in a little bit. Now this rotor is very rusted and it's stuck on here. Yours would hopefully come right off at this point. I'm going to put a lug nut back on. That way when I hammer this off, it doesn't come flying off. And you can hammer in multiple different ways. You can either hit right between the studs or hit the backside right here. I prefer to hit on the backside because it's more likely to break it free, but sometimes this works better. So just try whatever works best for you. There we go. Now it's off. Don't forget to save this little rubber piece. It's important. It caps off the hole where you can adjust your parking brake with the rotor still on. But if you leave this out, water can get in there, rust out things from the inside out, and that's not good. So save this. I'm going to spray the parking brake shoes and the springs and everything down because they usually have a lot of dust buildup on them. I don't want to breathe any of this in. I don't want it getting into the air. So spray it all down to get rid of it. And then we'll move along. This also cleans up any potential debris that may or may not have gotten in there. All right, let's let this dry. So from the back side, you can see your 4 wheel bearing bolts, 17mm in size. But first, I want to remove the ABS sensor, which is right here, held on with a 10mm bolt. Take that out, and then you can slowly wiggle the ABS sensor out. Set that aside safely. This is very delicate. You don't want it to get damaged. And now again with a 17mm socket, remove all 4 of these. All right, now take your hammer on each side of the bearing, top, bottom. Basically just wiggle it out of place with your hammer. Just be careful when it comes out that it doesn't fall on your feet. And also make sure you don't hit your parking brake shoes. Try to avoid that. So because I'm having trouble removing this wheel bearing when I hammer, I don't want to damage the parking brake shoes. And so I'm going to remove them. To do that, you want to take off these top 2 springs first. I'm going to use a pry bar, try to pry the springs out of here. Unfortunately, you can't use a tool because it doesn't fit in this hole, even if you had the special tool for the springs. Okay, those are off. Twist those out. Take this little piece off. Spread these pads or shoes apart a little bit. There's going to be a piece right here in the middle that you can take off. I'll remember that the spring will go towards the front of the vehicle on this one, and the part with the single hook towards the rear. Now to unlock the shoe from the backing plate here, you'll see these little retainers. You gotta press in with a screwdriver, twist it 90 degrees. That's gonna remove the locking pin with the spring and everything. Take this out, leave this right here. And then you wanna do the same to the other side. Twist it. There we go. That unlocked. Pull the shoes down. And you don't have to remove them completely from the vehicle. You can separate them at the bottom if you want. I'm just going to leave them like this because we're not actually removing them. I just wanted them out of the way so I can now hammer the wheel bearing and hub assembly off. Now back to our situation here. Let's hammer this off. Just be careful, sometimes this whole backing plate will come off of the knuckle, which is exactly what's happening here. Okay, that's fine. I have a plan for this. I'm gonna prop this up on my lift arm, and I'm just gonna use my hammer, hammer this out from the back side. Now with the wheel bearing off, I want to clean this surface here where the backing plate mounts. I want to make sure it's nice and flat. And then I also want to clean this inside ridge here. As you can see, it's got a lot of buildup, and that's not good because that means the new wheel bearing may potentially not seat itself all the way in, or it might sit a little bit crooked. Either way, you don't want that to happen. You want to sand this all down, scuff it up, use whatever you need to do, pry bar, screwdriver to scrape it, or a sanding disc, which is what I'm going to use. Basically, get this all nice and clean. We'll coat it with some anti-seize, and then we'll reassemble. Let's clean this up with some brake parts cleaner. Get all the dust and debris off. Now coat this in some anti-seize, that way the rust doesn't build up again, and if it does, at least it won't be as bad. All right, now this surface over here, you want to clean up as well if it's in poor condition. Mine is actually in decent condition, so I'm just going to leave this. This inner ring here, I'm just going to wipe off with a rag. This one's also in good condition, so this part is going to get coated with anti-seize from the knuckle here, and then this I'll coat with anti-seize right before the wheel bearing goes on. And looks like this side is also in decent condition, so I guess we're ready to install the new bearing. I'm going to give the back of the wheel bearing a very light, quick coating of anti-seize, and you want to make sure you don't get it in the ABS hole. I'm using the spray, but of course if you use the brush, that's a little bit better, more controlled. You don't need a lot here. I just want to coat the bare metal, just like that. Perfect. We kind of have to juggle two things at once here. You have to hold the backing plate up, line up the wheel bearing, and make sure that the ABS hole is pointing in the right direction. And it was towards the front of the vehicle, so it has to go in this way. So let's put this through the backing plate, and then line it up with the knuckle. And now, while you're still holding it, put in one of the bolts at least. That way everything is held in place. So let's see, I can reach this one. You'll have to twist things in order to line them up because it's unlikely that it's going to line up perfectly right off the bat. Oh, there we go. This bolt just went through. I'm starting on this bottom one, and once this one is actually started onto the threads, a few threads I can let go, and then I'll put the other ones in from there. So let's start in the other three bolts. Wiggle the wheel bearing and the backing plate as needed to get these lined up. Just make sure you start the threads in by hand in order to prevent cross-threading. All right, let's bottom these out and then we'll torque them to 77 foot-pounds. I'm going to go in a cross pattern. That way the wheel bearing seats itself completely up against the knuckle. Go back to this one for a second. There we go. All right, so those are all tight. Let's torque them. I'm also going to torque these in a cross pattern. Just going to double check this first one. Alright, so they're all tight. Get your ABS sensor installed into the new wheel bearing. Put the bolt back in, bottom it out, and just give it a quick snug. You don't have to go crazy tight with this because it is a small bolt. You don't want to break it. There we go. Now before we put the parking brake shoes back, since I have them apart, I might as well clean everything up and re-lubricate things. There are some raised areas. That's where the parking brake shoe actually sits up against and pivots as it's operating. So I'm just going to take a wire brush and lightly clean off any rust or buildup that might be on there. And then we'll grease it up with some brake grease. Put a thin layer of brake grease on these areas. You don't need a lot, just enough to cover the bare metal, prevent rust, and allow these to function without any excess noise. But if you put too much in here, it'll, as it heats up and gets a little less solid, it'll actually get onto your braking surface, so you don't want that. And since we have this adjuster out, I went ahead and put a little bit of grease on these threads. They were not seized or anything anyway, so it was fine. It didn't need any, but I put some because it's a part, so might as well. Now take this parking brake shoe, and the one with the parking brake lever goes on the rear, towards the rear of the vehicle. The other one goes towards the front of the vehicle. I'm going to hook this spring back on, and then I'm going to put the adjuster in. The threaded part goes on the shoe with the parking brake lever, and the non-threaded part goes on the other shoe. Slide that in like this. Put the shoes up and over, and now we'll use these little pins to lock them in. Need a screwdriver. So this one actually for me stayed in here, which is convenient. If yours came out, just put the pin, put the spring on, then the cap, and then the pin. I'll show you on the other side because that one for me came off. And then you line it up with that hole right there. And as you push it in, twist it 90 degrees and it'll lock in for you. Oh, there we go. That's through. Twist it 90 degrees. That's locked in. Let's just make sure the shoe is sitting where it needs to. Now it is. And let's do the same to the other shoe. So if your locking pin came apart, you put the spring on first, then this little cap, and then the pin. Push it through the hole. And once you line it up with the backing plate, it's going to be kind of tricky to see. I'm not going to lie. Oh, there we go. Twist it 90 degrees. That's locked in. Now take this top piece, spread the shoes apart, slide this through, and like I mentioned earlier, the part with the side with the spring goes on this front pad. And it's got a kind of a hook even over the spring here that has to hook onto that slot. Press the shoe back down and then line it up with the rear. Again, it's also got a hook on this side. Oh, there we go. That just seated itself all the way. You want to make sure that when you squeeze the top, there isn't a gap between this mounting point and the shoe. Before you put the top springs on, put on this little plate here. That's what will hold the pads in on the top. Once the springs are on, take the spring, hook it on to the smaller hole. You'll see there's a larger and a smaller. You want to go onto the smaller one. And once it's in there, twist it around to lock it in. And now you can use either a screwdriver, locking pliers, a pry bar, whatever works for you. I have this tool that has a cutout here that's going to hold on to the top. All right, there's one spring. Make sure that pad is fully seated. Let's do the bottom spring. And then take this spring, slide it in just like the other one. Oops. Twist it around, hook it onto your tool, whatever you might be using. Slide it over. Ensure that everything's locked into place. Make sure this plate here is seated all the way, which it is. That's what's going to hold the pads up against the backing plate at the top. Everything's good. I'm going to coat the hub in anti-seize. It's a good idea to do this so that the rotor doesn't get stuck in the future, and it'll prevent rust from building up. I'm using the brushed kind because I don't want to spray the spray type on the parking brake shoes by accident. This is a little bit more controlled. And just a thin coating all around will do the trick. You don't need to put a lot on. You just need enough to cover the bare metal and focus especially on this inner ring here. That's where a lot of the rust likes to build up. But of course, cover the whole surface. And try to avoid getting it on the lug studs as much as possible. If it gets on, just wipe it off. It's not a big deal. But try to avoid it if possible. All right, let's grab the rotor. Now take your rotor and slide it on, and we're going to adjust the parking brake shoes. You can hear that as I'm spinning it, it's not touching up against the e-brake shoes, which is not good. You want them to touch just a little bit. So let's pull this back off. It'll be easier to start adjusting this way. And if you line up this slot with the adjuster, you can stick your screwdriver or pry bar in there and just turn this adjuster. For me, I have to turn it down in order to adjust it out and basically expand the shoes. I'm holding the spring up and expanding this with my thumb. All right, so the rotor slides on. That's good. And at this point, I'm going to put on the lug nut. This is going to hold the rotor flush up against the hub for me. And I'm going to adjust, do some fine adjustments here. So that's actually perfect. They're not drum brakes, so they don't have to have a lot of drag to them, but you do have to hear them touch a little bit. So we'll leave it at that. So I have the caliper bracket on the workbench here. I'm going to start by removing the anti-rattle clips here. Pop these out. We're going to have to clean underneath them because this is pretty rusty. You can use a little pry bar, screwdriver, whatever you have to get these off. There we go. And typically, if the rust buildup isn't too bad, you would use a wire brush. Obviously, in our case, a wire brush isn't going to cut it, no matter how hard I try. So you can either, if you don't have a sanding or grinding disc, you can either use a pry bar, screwdriver, or whatever you have to chisel out the rust. What I'm going to use, though, is a cutting disc like this. It's not the ideal tool, but if you do use it, make sure you don't grind too much material away. You just want to scrape off the surface rust, but sometimes you have to dig in through a lot of rust. So I'm just going to gently scrape off everything. Let's clean off the dust. Now again, this is not perfect, but it's way better than it was. And once this dries off, we'll put a thin coating of grease on here to hopefully prevent this from happening in the future. You don't want this area to swell up because it'll actually squish the pad in between the bottom and the top. Then you'll have braking issues, and you don't want quite this much grease on here because it'll squeeze out onto the rotor. Just a thin layer. There we go. Apply it to both sides, and then take your new anti-rattle clips, line them up with where they're supposed to go, and press them on Make sure they go on all the way down, on both sides of course. There we go. And now, if you had rust buildup in your slider pinholes, you would want to take off these boots and use a bore brush in there. Mine are actually okay, so I'm not going to use a bore brush. I will, however, clean up the inside of these boots, get some of that old grease out, and the way you do that is you just slide a rag right through. It comes out the other side. As you pull it through, make sure you have a nice clean area of the rag inside there, and then just squeeze it, kind of knead it like this, and this will get most of the grease out onto your rag. Do this to both. You want to clean up this ridge here. That's where the boot sits, and if it's not clean, it won't make a good seal. Then you'll get water buildup in there. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just scrape off as much of the rust buildup as you can. And do that to both sides. Okay, before we put the boots on, I'm going to apply a thin coat of grease here right over this ridge. And that's going to help seal up the boot up against the bracket. Put the boots back on. Give them a couple twists to work that grease in. And then I'm also going to add grease to the inside of the boots. With the grease in there, it's going to act as a reserve of grease for the sliders. You can't put a lot on the sliders because it's going to get wiped off as you try to slide them in. So the best way to do it is to add some in there. Not a ton, but some. Then of course we'll lubricate the sliders as well, but you can't put a lot on them. Work that grease in there. And then this is one of the sliders, the only one that we were able to take off. I'm going to wipe the grease off of this. I'm actually going to take mine over to the wire wheel so I can clean up this rust buildup in here. This is not too bad. It's definitely salvageable. You just need to wire brush it off as much as you can. Use some brake parts cleaner to degrease the threads here. I'm just going to add some grease to this now that I cleaned it. Not a lot, just a very thin layer. Like I said, if you put too much, it's just going to get wiped off as you slide it in. So just enough to coat it, and I'm going to make sure that there's some in that ridge. That's where the boot seals up. Try not to get any on the threads. We'll leave this aside for now. We're going to put this on with the caliper because this is what bolts the caliper up to the bracket. But for now, let's put the bracket back onto the vehicle. Slide on your caliper bracket, bolt it back up. Snug these up and then torque them to 52 foot-pounds. There's one and two. Next, grab your inner pad, slide that in. You have to kind of twist it at an angle to make it slide in. There we go. And once it's in, you want to make sure it moves freely like this. If it gets stuck, that's not good. That means you didn't clean up the bracket enough and it's getting squished, and then you'll have braking issues down the road. As for the outer pad, this is actually clipped on to the caliper, so I'm going to have to pry it out. This thing's pretty rusty. There we go. Get that off of here. Clean up this area. You can see I have some debris here. Make sure it's a nice flat mounting surface. And then before we put on the new pad, I'm going to apply some grease to this area. A thin layer will do. And then you want to take the new pad and just slide it down into place. There we go. That seated itself. You want to make sure it's nice and flush with the caliper. And then the slider pin that we were not able to remove, I went ahead and put some new grease on it, just a little bit, not a lot. And before we mount this up, as you can see, we have to push this piston back. And with my large pair of pliers, I'm just going to slowly squeeze this piston in. Make sure no debris gets stuck back there. All right, that's all the way in. Apply a thin coating of grease to the outer ring of the piston. Now take your caliper, slide the slider into where it belongs, like that. Make sure the boot seats in all the way. Slide the caliper down. Let's put the other slider pin through. Start it onto the threads. We'll tighten it up and torque it to 32 foot-pounds. That's 32. Now if you haven't taken that lug nut off yet, go ahead and do that. And don't forget to put in your plug for this hole. It's important, like I said earlier, water can make its way in if you don't plug it up. At this point, let's get the wheel back on. Now before you put on your lug nuts on this, because we have a hubcap that actually gets held on by the lug nuts, you have to put this on first. And there's a cutout here that has to line up with your valve stem. Otherwise it won't sit on properly. So now that this is on, you can put on all 5 of your lug nuts, snug them up, and then torque them to 100 foot-pounds. There you go.